Hi debaters, let's spend some time looking at how affirmative teams can respond to disadvantages run by the negative team. In the world of debate, there are 9 classic strategies that affirmative teams can use. But before we start on our list, let's take a moment to discuss impact calculus. I introduced this concept in the disadvantages video, so let's take a moment to review. Impact calculus is defined as the comparison between the desirable impacts of the affirmative advantages to the undesirable impacts of the negative disadvantages. Now, without realizing it, you already do impact calculus every day of your life. Should you spend time with friends or study for the math test? Should you tell that friend about the rumor you heard about her, or just keep it to yourself? When comparing these options, you likely use 3 measuring sticks to evaluate your decision: time frame, probability, and magnitude. Let's use our studying example to try it out. If you decide to study time with your friends, the benefits are immediate. Whereas if you study for the test, it will be a few days before the grade hits the gradebook. So spending time with friends might win the time frame debate. When it comes to probability, you are certainly going to have fun with your friends, and although studying for the test will increase your chances of doing well, it's not as certain as the guarantee of fun with your friends. So your friends also win the probability debate. Now, let's take a look at magnitude. If you spend time with your friends, the benefits are obvious, but they aren't necessarily big. You spent time with them before, and you'll spend time with them again. So spending time with them tonight won't necessarily be life-changing. However, not studying for a test could have a big impact on your grade, and a bad grade on your test could affect your course grade, your GPA, or even your social life when your parents find out. So studying for the test wins the magnitude debate. Now it's time to compare the measuring sticks. Spending time with your friends won the time frame and probability debates, but studying for the test won the magnitude debates. Does that mean you decide to spend time with friends because it won 2 of the 3 debates? Nice try, but that's not really how it works. The magnitude in this case overwhelms the time frame and the probability because the consequences for failing the test are far worse than the benefits of spending time with friends. In an actual debate round, you won't be arguing about friends versus tests, but you'll be using the same 3 measuring sticks to evaluate the impacts. If the affirmative team says their plan improves the economy and the negative team says the plan will lead to a global pandemic, it's time to do some impact calc. Global pandemic wins the magnitude debate because if it happens, it's far worse than a healthier economy. But perhaps the economic benefits are a lot more likely to happen than the global pandemic, so the affirmative wins the probability debate. As for time frame, that one might be a toss-up unless either team has evidence to suggest that one impact happens before the other. So the impact calc debate would probably come down to magnitude versus probability. And if either side can tip the scales in favor of one or the other, they are more likely to win their impact. Now that we've discussed impact calc, let's go back and take a look at the 9 classic ways the affirmative team can respond to a disadvantage. The 9 responses are typically classified in 3 categories: takeouts, which are arguments designed to cancel, refute, or eliminate the claims made by the negative; turns, which are designed to flip negative arguments into affirmative arguments; and thresholds, which argue that the dangerous impact is farther away than we think. Let's start with the takeouts, and there's one for each of the 4 parts of a disad: uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact. To argue that the disad is non-unique is to argue that the affirmative plan isn't the only thing that would or could trigger the disad, or that the disad has already happened. If the disad claims that the government spending will hurt the economy or trade off with other important programs, a good affirmative team will argue that the government spends lots of money, so the impacts will occur regardless of whether the judge votes affirmative. Thus, it is better to realize the advantages of the affirmative plan with the impact of the disad than to reject the affirmative, lose the advantages, and only be left with the impact. You'll recall our politics disadvantage from our previous video. The politics disadvantage assumes that one political party is about to cooperate with the other political party on some important upcoming legislation. The argument that the affirmative plan kills the spirit of cooperation by using up all the goodwill built up between the 2 parties. Now, I would argue that this assumption is non-unique because our 2 political parties have made it obvious that they do not intend to cooperate on anything. It's non-unique because passing the affirmative plan won't kill the spirit of cooperation. That was dead long before the debate round started. Note that when you argue that a disad is non-unique, you want to make your arguments if-then statements to avoid agreeing with the negative team. It's one thing to say, if government spending leads to war, then we would have already seen the impacts occur. It's quite another thing to say, war is going to happen anyway. The second takeout is to argue that the link between the affirmative plan and the disad doesn't exist. By disproving the link, an affirmative team can completely sidestep a disadvantage. If the negative team claims that the plan is expensive and will lead to global economic disaster, the affirmative team might claim that the plan is relatively inexpensive and that it does not link to the disad. The no-link argument is very effective in responding to a disadvantage because it removes the affirmative plan completely from the scene of the crime. It's the equivalent of having videotape proof that you were in Paris when a crime you were accused of committing occurred in your hometown. The third takeout is to disprove the internal link. We already know that the internal link often proves why or how the link causes the impact. So if the internal link is disproven, there's no connection between the link and the impact. Here's an example. Let's say the negative team claims that passing the affirmative plan trades off with funding a more important plan like research for preventing Ebola. That argument only works if the internal link is true. And in order for it to be true, the negative team would have to prove that Congress will eliminate funding for Ebola research if the affirmative plan passes. That claim is murky at best, and a good affirmative team will study the evidence used by the negative team in the internal link. A great affirmative team will have evidence to disprove the internal link, perhaps even evidence that claims that Ebola research funding is a priority for Congress. The internal links in most disadvantages should always be subject to intense scrutiny by the affirmative team. It's hard to imagine that a simple affirmative plan will lead to mass extinction, nuclear war, or global pandemic. Yet too many negative teams get away with weak internal links that try to make the illogical leap from link to impact. Smart affirmative teams will not only study the negative evidence carefully, but they will also be prepared to offer evidence that suggests the internal links aren't as ironclad as the negative team claims. That takes us to the impact takeouts. It can be tricky to claim that war, disease, and famine aren't bad things, so the strategy for an impact takeout works a little differently, and it's called an impact non-uniqueness. That's a $1 word for a 10-cent concept. Non-uniquing the impact is simply saying that either these circumstances have happened before and we didn't see the impact happen, or that the impact just won't ever happen. For example, if the negative team claims that action by the federal government will anger the states and lead to a civil war, the affirmative team should probably claim that the federal government has done things like this many times without civil war occurring. And while the negative team might respond by saying this time is different, good affirmative teams will demand evidence to prove that this particular affirmative plan is strong enough to trigger a civil war. Those are the four types of takeouts: non-unique link, no internal link, and impact non-uniqueness. Now let's go to the second category of responses to disadvantages: turns. Turns are powerful tools that turn negative arguments into affirmative arguments. There are three types of turns: link turns, impact turns, and straight turns. A link turn occurs when an affirmative team proves that the affirmative plan prevents the link from happening, rather than causing the link to happen. In other words, the affirmative claims that the status quo links to the disad, but the affirmative plan prevents that. Here's an example. The negative team claims in their link that the affirmative plan spends all the political capital, thus ruining the chances of passing more important legislation later. A link turn might claim that there is no political capital now, which means that the important legislation wouldn't pass in the status quo. But the affirmative plan creates a spirit of bipartisanship that allows the legislation to pass. Notice that the disadvantage now becomes an advantage for the affirmative team because the affirmative plan increases the chances that future important legislation will pass rather than decreasing it. An impact turn occurs when the affirmative team proves that the impact is desirable. That can be tough to do, and it often requires the affirmative team to take an unpopular position. For example, if the negative team claims that the affirmative plan leads to economic depression, the affirmative team might present evidence that an economic depression is a good thing because it pops the artificial inflation bubble and resets the economy. Now, while suggesting that economic depression is a good thing can be unpopular in front of inexperienced judges, more experienced judges who understand that debate is a hypothetical game might grant the argument to the affirmative team. And if the impact is now a good thing and the affirmative plan causes the good thing to happen, the argument gets turned at the impact level and becomes an affirmative argument that the negative team must now disprove. 3 notes before we move on. First, be careful not to double turn yourself by reading a link turn and an impact turn. Doing so effectively proves that the affirmative team prevents a good thing from happening, which would be bad for the affirmative. Second, you need to do a lot of specific evidence finding to prove your claims. You can't just make the argument based on logic or analytics. You need strong evidence. Third, even if you correctly turn a link or turn an impact, you may still want to put some defense on the remaining parts of the disadvantage. Doing so is the equivalent of saying, look, we prevent this link from happening. But even if you don't accept that, the internal link is still weak, and you should reject this disad because no matter what you accept at the link level, it will never reach the impact level because we've disproven the internal link. The same is true for impact turns when you claim that regardless of whether economic depression is good or bad, the disad is still non-unique and the affirmative plan isn't strong enough to trigger the disad. Putting defense on the argument gives you backup in case your link or impact turns fail. But what if you don't want to add defense? What if you're so confident in your link or impact turns that you actually want the disadvantage to happen? That's the final type of turn, and it's called a straight turn. A straight turn occurs when the affirmative team effectively turns the link or the impact and intentionally chooses not to put any defense on the rest of the disad. It's the equivalent of saying that you agree with the negative team that this disad will occur, but because of your link turn or your impact turn, the outcome of the disad favors the affirmative team more than the negative team. Finally, let's look at the last category of disad responses, thresholds and brinks. A threshold or a brink is the final step before you cross into new territory. Every door has a threshold that separates two spaces. The basic underlying premise of every disad is that voting for the affirmative plan will move us past some invisible threshold from which we cannot recover, sort of like falling off the edge of a cliff. So the first type of threshold response is simply to point out that the negative team never offers a clear threshold or a clear breaking point from which we cannot recover. This is true for a lot of economic arguments. If the negative team claims that the affirmative plan costs $10 billion, which adds to the national debt, which crashes the economy, a good affirmative team will point out that the negative team fails to provide a threshold or a clear breaking point at which the national debt burden is so great that it crashes the economy. The second type of threshold response is to claim that uniqueness overwhelms the link, which is a really fancy way of saying that the status quo is much stronger than the negative team claims it is, and it can easily absorb the weight of the affirmative plan. For example, if the negative team claims that the federal action will anger the states and lead to civil war, the affirmative could respond by saying that uniqueness overwhelms the link and that we are so far from a civil war that the affirmative plan does little or nothing to trigger the impact. Okay, so that's it for disad responses. Let's take a moment to look at what we've learned today. Takeouts, turns, threshold, impact calculus, probability, time frame, magnitude, non-unique, no link, no internal link, impact non-uniqueness, link turns, impact turns, straight turns, no threshold, uniqueness overwhelms the link. That's a lot. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.